We're now turning to one of the most interesting, disturbing, enigmatic, and provocative books in the entire Old Testament, and that is the book of Judges. The book of Judges deals with just an incredible series of events. It presents us with an incredible set of characters that are unforgettable, sometimes for all the wrong reasons. And what we want to do now is explore that book and see what it tells us about Israel's experience as they moved into Canaan and tried to establish themselves. And it shows us the people of God also, to be honest with you, falling flat on their faces time after time. And so we'll see what we can learn by looking at the text, and then we will look at the event horizon that shapes what we find in the text, and then we'll see what truth we can derive from that exploration. So I've entitled this Love in the Ruins, robbing a title from one of my favorite novelists, Walker Percy. And this is The End of the World and What They Did About It. The boring adult title is The Book of Judges Text Event Truth. Sorry about that. But I want to, first of all, set a large context here in the general biblical narrative. In the book of Joshua, we see that Israel forms a nation in Canaan. Chapters 1 to 12, we get that military account. And then in chapters 13 to 24, we get the allocation of the land. And it ends, as we've seen last time, with this marvelous ritual at the end where they all unify together in dedication to Yahweh and look forward to being God's people in the land. Now we look to the Judges. In the book of Judges, we see this community is in crisis. This is in the first 2 or 3 chapters of Judges, 1:1 to 3:6. We will get a foreshadowing of the failure that is to come and have to ask ourselves, what happened to these people? How did they go from the bright hope at the end of the book of Joshua to the complete sputtering out and stalling out of these chapters? Then in Judges 3:7 to 16:31, we will see this community gradually declining and spinning down, and they will have leader after leader after leader, and each one in some way will be a little worse or a little less helpful than the one before. Until then, in Judges 17 to 21, we will see this collapsed community floundering around, flailing in a self-destructive sort of fashion, and we will stare at that in horror and wonder, just where do we go from here? Many people consider the last 3 chapters of the book of Judges some of the most disturbing material they have ever read anywhere, not just in the Old Testament, but anywhere. But not to leave you on too negative a place, we will take a moment to look at the book of Ruth, which I call Real Housewives of Iron Age Israel. Again, Love in the Ruins. We'll see a different picture of a different kind of life that happened during this period. Then in 1 Samuel, we see then the rise of kingship. This is the story of Samuel, the great prophet and kingmaker who appoints Saul to be king. Saul is then rejected, and David becomes king in his place. And so in the first 8 chapters, we have the story of how Israel came to request or demand that Samuel appoint them a king. Then in chapters 9 through 15, we see Saul emerging as a wonderful guy, a gifted person with all sorts of promise and potential. And he starts with initial triumphs, but then begins to stumble, and before you know it, he has fallen on He will ultimately fall on his own sword. He's rejected from being king, and David is appointed in his place. And in chapters 16 to 31 of 1 Samuel, we will see David rising and Saul struggling, and there will be the conflict between them that will finally end with Saul's catastrophic death in chapter 31. The story rolls right on into 2 Samuel with hardly a break, with the rise of David's house in chapters 1 through 8. where David will become king first in Hebron, and after 7 years of ruling from Hebron, he will move to Jerusalem and become king there and rule for 33 years there. The story of Bathsheba in chapters 9 through 11 is a turning point in the life of David. Just like Saul has triumphs and then faces a test where he fails catastrophically and is rejected, David, after his triumphs, now will face a test. He will fail, but his response to that failure will be different from Saul's, and David will endure. And then in chapters 13 to 24, then we see what I like to just call the sword in David's house. We see that even though David is forgiven of his sins, that the violence and jealousy and paranoia that he has unleashed through his actions with Bathsheba threaten to tear down his house. And at one point, David will be on the run with his son Absalom usurping him, and we'll see David struggle to hold on to his kingship just by a thread. And finally, he will emerge victorious, but a very different sort of guy than he was at the very beginning. So those are the main biblical books that have to do with the passage from the death of Joshua, or from the emergence into the land to the establishment of a royal monarchic state. Now let's zero in on the book of Judges. And the first thing we notice in the book of Judges is that there is a turning point. The book opens by saying, after the death of Joshua in 1:1. And then we will get another statement in chapter 2:6, where the tape will roll back and again return to the moment when Joshua dies, and at that point actually quote from the story of Joshua's death and burial in the book of Joshua. And that will be setting the tone for the introductory section of Judges in 1:1 to 3:6. That is, first we will get an external view of how Israel fails in occupying the land. And that will be 1:1 to 2:5. And so their mission has been aborted, and they have failed to occupy the land. Then, in 2:6 to 3:6, we will get an internal, more theological, spiritually nuanced view of Israel's lapsed loyalty to Yahweh. Here we will see Israel's identity abandoned, or at least at risk. And in that crisis, then, we will move to a series of stories in which Israel will sin against God, fall under God's judgment, a hero will rise to deliver them, and overall this will be a story of compromise and capitulation, where Israel will become like the nations around them in sin and worshiping every god really except Yahweh, and they will fall under judgment and require God's deliverance. And this is typically presented as a cycle. And I want to show you this cycle, but then I want to show you that the cycle is not really the whole story on the book of Judges. But this is the apparent cycle that the book presents. We start with Israel sinning. It says the children of Israel, the Israelites, did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. A lot of times they don't tell us what that is, but whatever it was bad. As a result, Yahweh's wrath is poured out, and Israel is oppressed by other nations. This oppression brings them to the breaking point, and Israel cries out. Now, it's important to realize that this outcry is not repentance. This is just ouch, a scream of anguish that comes from Israel. And as a result of that outcry, in His mercy, Yahweh raises up a hero who will then deliver Israel. And we're told then after that the land rests. And sometimes as you get to the end of the book, instead of saying the land rests, it will just say, and so judged Israel so many years. Then the hero will die, just like Joshua did. And just like Israel fell away after Joshua's death, so also Israel falls back into sin when the hero dies, and the whole crazy process starts over. Now, as we look at this cycle, the thing I want to point out is that it's not actually a cycle. A cycle just implies the same story over and over, and sort of like a sitcom, where from the end of one story, one episode, to the beginning of the next, there's not really any movement. It just sort of same old characters, new situation, same old gags. But what we get here is that with each turn of this cycle, there's going to be something different, so that it's not exactly a cycle. So we start with Israel's evil. If you take all the verses that I've put up here and read them, you will find that as the story goes on, Israel's evil gets worse and worse and worse. The sin is laid out in more detail, it becomes more grave, and then the wrath of Yahweh will grow greater and greater and greater in each story. Then Israel will cry out, and at first Yahweh will deliver them. Then, starting with the Gideon story, Yahweh will yell at them first before he delivers them. He'll deliver a rebuke. Then in the Jephthah story, Yahweh will reject their cry and say, call out to the other gods that you worship. See if they can deliver you. Then when we come to the Samson story, when they cry out, well, what happens is there is no outcry. Israel is silent before the wrath of their offended Lord. So the cry is a real index for the declining quality of the story. The judges also will become increasingly complicated. Our first judge, Othniel, we just know a little bit about this guy. The Spirit comes on me, goes out there, and he defeats the enemy, and yay, we win. Then the Ehud story, similar, a little more detail. He's got his knife, his dagger, he stabs. I love the story. I better not get started talking about it or we'll be here all day. But as we read through the book of Judges, the biographical detail on these guys gets more and more extensive. Until then you get Gideon. We learn all about Gideon's ambivalence, and he doesn't know, he can't really trust Yah. Is this really God's word, or can you give me a sign? And Gideon then sometimes seems like he's serving the Lord, and other times he seems just like a bitter, vengeful guy. Very complicated story. We sort of wish we didn't know some of this stuff about him. Then with Jephthah, we get his whole backstory, how he's not a legitimate member of his tribe, and he's rejected, and he's called back, and there's a bitter undercurrent in the story. Then with Samson, we get a full-blown cradle-to-grave biography on this guy. So the judges become increasingly complicated. And you know the way we use the phrase complicated today, where we say somebody like, why aren't you still dating so-and-so? And if somebody says, well, it's complicated, that means you don't want to know. This is a bad story. And so the judges are becoming increasingly complicated. Also, the judges increasingly fail to truly reflect Yahweh's salvation and Yahweh's will for Israel. The oppression and barbarism also begin to arise within Israel itself. So with chapter 9, we have the story of Abimelech, in which a sort of homegrown guy in Israel's territory makes himself king and becomes an oppressor. And then we have the story of Jephthah, where the judge, an Israelite Jephthah, slaughters a whole bunch of Ephraimites. And he becomes suddenly now a worse killer of Israelites than even the foreign nations were. And so the pattern here also, that order prevails until the judge dies. If you look at these stories, it really doesn't seem to go that way. Like with Jephthah and the killing of all those Ephraimites, or Samson, we never really see order in the Samson story. Israel is constantly fretting about the Philistines. Now, Samson, to his credit, does successfully beat back the Philistine thrust from the particular valley where he lived. They never try that again. The next time we see the Philistines, they're coming up the Elah Valley in the stories of David. But still, it doesn't look like that everything is constantly, consistently great after the deliverance by the judge. And so by a lot of different measures, and many of them I'm not able to go into in this lecture, we can see that things progressively deteriorate. So what we have here is not a cycle. What we have here is more like a death spiral. Israel isn't just going doop, doo-doo. Israel is going like this. And any minute now, we have to ask the question, how is this going to end? Now, one of the things we notice reading these stories is that we are looking at a dysfunctional community here, if I may make the understatement of the year. And it's worth just stopping a minute and looking at some of the marks of this dysfunctional community. And for some of you, this is going to be a sermon you preach sometime. Probably it'll be the sermon you preach just before you have to leave your church. But here's some of the marks of a dysfunctional community. First of all, they have a repetitive pattern of wrong choices. We read over and over, again, Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. There comes a point where you just say, why don't you guys learn? And oops, I did it again is the theme of what happens here. Then we have Israel's habitual identity as a victim. They're constantly given into the hands of those who oppress them. And Israel has an identity as a victim because Israel many times is a victim. And they're a victim because they keep making the wrong choices that expose them to exploitation and victimhood. And as a result, Israel's religion is not a religion of right relationship with God. It becomes a religion of continuous desperation. A religion where God's only real function seems to be to pull them out of some hole that they have knowingly, eyes wide open, driven right into. And so the Israelites cried to Yahweh. They are in a constant state of emergency, constantly needing rescue. And so, as I've said, this cycle is not just a cycle, it is a death spiral. And so the question we have to ask then is, where is this going? How will this end? And the way it will end is in Judges 17 to 21. Israel now plunges into chaos and crisis. We see in chapter 17, Israel's worship is distorted as a young Israelite man steals some silver, uses it to make an image of Yahweh. So he's violating the second commandment against images, but not the first commandment about worshiping other gods. He's got an image of Yahweh, and then he is kidnapped or taken or appealed to by the tribe of Dan, and on their way, having failed to possess the inheritance God gave them, they're out looking for any town they can conquer, any easy target. They seize on a city called Laish. They slaughter the people there without any command or guidance from God to do this. And they settle there and make it their city. And so Israel's worship is distorted, and Israel's mission of taking possession of the land is horribly perverted. Chapter 18 reads like a conquest narrative by simply a bunch of savages. It does not read like the stories in Joshua, where you have this measured attempt to take apart an oppressive political system so that the land is still habitable. The story in chapter 18 is quite different. Then in chapters 19 and following, we have an atrocity in chapter 19, a ghastly story that leads to a civil war in chapter 20, and then leads to the near destruction of the tribe of Benjamin in chapter 21. And so what's happening in these chapters is the collapse of the tribal confederation that had composed Israel. And the repeated statement in these last 5 chapters, only here, by the way, not in the other part of the book, the repeated statement here is, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And this parallels, in a way, the earlier part of the book where it said they did what was evil in Yahweh's eyes. Now they're doing what is right in their own eyes. And I think our author is wanting to juxtapose these things. What is evil in the eyes of Yahweh and what is right in our own eyes are related. So there are really 2 penetrating observations that the book will end with. The first one is a political observation. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And this statement is hammered home 4 different times. And the point this statement is trying to make is that the divine community functions through just human structures and leadership. And this is a hard point to make. You will sometimes hear people say Israel wasn't supposed to have a human king because God was their divine king. Well, that's not exactly the right logic, because God is also their divine judge, but Israel had plenty of human judges. All the roles that God plays are metaphors of human roles, and they don't preclude humans being in limited ways in those roles. But we see here in the book of Judges that this community that God has ordained is supposed to function through just human structures and leadership. So when that poor woman is being horribly treated in Judges 19, when you read it, when I read it, we say, God, where are you in this story? And God, if Israel is saying, God, where are you when this happened? God's answer is, where were you? I put this woman in a community that was supposed to be my covenant people, committed to justice and righteousness and right dealing. So the issue isn't where was God in those stories. The issue is, where was Israel? And so the divine community has to function through just human structures and leadership. The other half of this statement is, each one did what was right in his own eyes. And this is really a significant statement. This is the essence of barbarianism, the arrogant idolatry of self-will. The sin that is worse than doing what is evil in Yahweh's eyes is to say, I am going to be the final standard of what's right. I will do what is right in my own eyes. I will worship myself. I will take my rights, my prerogatives, my power, and take care of my needs ahead of anybody and everybody else. Now, I'm giving this lecture during the lockdown period, during the COVID-19 pandemic that started at the end of 2019 and stretched into 2020. And there are a lot of people who say, well, as I read the Constitution of the United States of America, the government cannot tell me that I have to stay home. Now, aside from the fact that that's wrong in terms of Supreme Court decisions and so forth, we won't go there. Here's somebody who's saying, even though I am potentially, maybe unknowingly, spreading a fatal, lethal, infectious disease to others, I will exercise my right to go where I please, and I don't care what anybody else says. Well, I will do what is right in my own eyes may sound good to a certain kind of person, but to the author of the book of Judges, it's an abomination. Now, the real hero of our book emerges when we look at this book in grand perspective. You had the nations that oppressed Israel, and the heroes arose up to save Israel from their oppressors. And so that was really exciting. However, in the last 5 chapters, we discover that Israel's worst identity, Israel's gravest oppression, was themselves. And so that's the juxtaposition of they did what was evil in Yahweh's eyes, and they did what was right in their own eyes. And here's the implicit question that this story leaves at the end of the book of Judges. Our heroes saved us from our oppressors. But where is the hero who will save us from ourselves? And the hint of the answer comes in that repeated statement, there was no king in Israel. Now we have to ask the question, how did this happen? The book of Joshua closed with tremendous optimism and hope for this new community planted in Canaan with a new vision based on covenant allegiance and to Yahweh and solidarity with each other. Wherever we've come from, whatever we've done, whatever our past, We have sworn allegiance to Yahweh. We have entered into the covenant. We are now one people in Yahweh. The book of Judges then opens with this entire enterprise in full collapse, and this community now at grave risk. And so the question is, what in the world happened? And that takes us back to the opening words of the book of Judges. After the death of Joshua. A funny thing must have happened on the way home from Joshua's funeral. The book of Judges doesn't really tell us what that was, but historians can tell us what that was. And to explain this part of the text, we now have to turn to the event horizon of the book of Judges. And that's what we'll do in part 2 of this lecture on the book of Judges. The end of the world and what they did about it.